Hey, Jonah.
Hey, Bob, how's it going?
I'm not too bad. How are you doing?
I am okay. I am poised to go on a major adventure with my daughter in a few days. And
where are you going?
We're going to drive out to a speech I have to give in Colorado, and then we are going to work our way back through amusement parks and water parks as we see fit.
Jonah, could you bring a camcorder and maybe give us some footage for Blogging Heads of you in a water park?
No. I will only be revealing what water parks I visit after I leave them.
Well, we could do a tape delay thing of 7 minutes to 7 days.
I think this is one of these rare areas of bipartisan consensus, is that the world does not need a lot of footage of me at a water park.
The whole drift of modern media, Jonah, is that there is no time offline. I mean, the next step beyond Twitter is just having electrodes implanted in your brain and your every activity automatically conveyed to everyone. And I think it's time you took the next step toward that.
I'll take it under advisement.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
So, this Republican debate happened last night, and I have to admit, I have been studiously avoiding these people and electoral politics in general, which, as a rule, I find so depressing that I generally avert my eyes. So really, for a lot of these people, it was. I mean, honestly, this is a terrible admission. Although I've been hearing about Tim Pawlenty for a long, long time as some kind of rising star. A week ago, I don't think I could have picked him out of a police lineup. That's how bad. That's how ignorant I am. But I did watch much of the debate. So I think I'm at least poised to participate in a conversation with you about it. Although you're going to have to provide all the deep insights. So give us one of those.
Oh gosh, deep insight. Well, first of all, I thought it was an eminently, again, grading on a curve. The same sort of curve as like the best Oktoberfest in Orlando. It was the best primary presidential debate we've seen in a long time, insofar as it moved quickly. It revealed some things about the candidates. I thought Fox, which is allegedly this mouthpiece of the GOP, asked tougher and rougher questions of these guys than any other presidential debate has maybe ever asked.
So much so that Newt Gingrich played the anti-Fox card, right?
Yeah, which is a very strange card. It's not in most conventional decks.
Right. He said the kinds of things that a conservative would win applause for saying to the liberal media, but he said them to Chris Wallace. Basically.
Yeah, although, Chris Wallace, I understand that anybody who is even remotely tainted by Fox News, according to like the lefty blogospheric kind of world, thinks that if you've even been in the elevator at Fox News, that somehow you're some sort of right wing trog.
That's my view. Yes.
But among conservatives, Chris Wallace is not seen like that at all.
Right. That's true.
And for good reason. I don't think he is one. I mean, I think he's, he might be more conservative than. Matt Lauer or something like that, but I don't think he's actually sort of a movement conservative type in any stretch. I think he thinks he is, and I think he has good reason to think it, sort of a relatively sort of down-the-middle, straight arrow journalist.
He's much closer to a real journalist than most at Fox, I would say, is the way I would put it.
Well, we're not going to get into it.
We're not going to. Well, we may later, actually. He wrote a column on liberal media bias. We may later have this argument, but for now you can continue with how hard-hitting the questions were. And,
I think that point has been made, and I don't think it's just going to be disputed. I thought Newt went to that well one time too many. Mm-hmm. The first time I think the audience liked it and it was good, but the third time on that Libya thing, I think he kind of made a fool of himself. Mm-hmm. And that said, look, I mean, there are a whole bunch of different ways you can score these things. You can score it on the merits, in which case I think, as much as it's possible to score it on the merits, you would probably say that Newt, Ron Paul, and Rick Santorum won in the sense that you would score a high school debating team. You
mean level of applause, or no? You don't.
No, that they made they offered internally consistent answers. They were comfortable on the stage. They made arguments that that whether or not you agree or disagree with their premises worked as arguments rather than just simply sound bites and all the rest. But I don't think that kind of scoring matters much, and in fact, I don't think it matters at all.
Right.
And so politically, it shows you how big a difference there is between political scoring and sort of substantive scoring. The biggest winner was obviously Rick Perry because he wasn't there, and which in a high school debate tournament, the guy who doesn't show up usually doesn't win, and so the only thing that's really of interest is I think that Pawlenty didn't help himself, which means he hurt himself a lot because he needed to do a lot. We'll see. He's got a pretty well organized team out there for the AIM straw poll, and so who knows?
Can you explain to me why Pawlenty was ever the chosen one to begin with? I mean, I've been hearing about him forever, and I finally took a look at him. He doesn't look like the guy who would play the president in the movie. He looks a little nerdy, a little goofy. He doesn't strike me as all that sharp verbally, as really all that well spoken. He's not especially effective, at least in a strictly logical sense. I mean, remember when Michelle Bachmann was going after him about how he had supported cap and trade, blah blah blah. He's shaking his head vigorously like she's lying, and then he says in response, basically, "You're lying." He talks about distorting his record, blah blah blah. But then, unless I missed something, he didn't back that up with an actual example, did he? Then he went into this riff about how she says that she fought Obamacare, but Obamacare passed. Well, I think it's a little too much to ask any one congressman to stop a whole piece of law. I mean, it was just non sequitur after non sequitur. I just find him later in the debate he had some slightly better moments, but I don't get why expectations have been so high for this guy.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable reaction, especially coming in, sort of late to the game, like you said you did. Part of it, the most persuasive case in the sort of pre-primary discussion of all this stuff was from my colleague and frequent Blogging Heads guest, Ramesh Ponnuru. Mm-hmm. And the basic argument was that on paper, Pawlenty is more appealing than Mitt Romney, and that Pawlenty could win it all if it came down to a race between him and Mitt Romney.
So if TV had not been invented, he would be our man.
If what?
If television had never been invented, he would be the guy to bet on. Pawlenty.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly part of it. Part of the problem is this whole Minnesota nice thing that people from Minnesota just don't play well on the national stage and all that. I'm not sure how true that is, but I think there's some of it. But the case was, look, he was a more conservative governor than Mitch Daniels in a more liberal state. And the Democrats desperately have to hold on to the upper Midwest if they want Obama to win. Okay. And so the argument was, here's this guy from the upper Midwest with a good conservative record in a blue state who knows how to appeal to independents and all of the rest. This is a good recipe for a general election candidate against Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. I think that's it's sort of like the case for Lamar Alexander in 1996. It is utterly compelling except for reality. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that as a candidate, Pawlenty, and maybe he'll do much better in the straw poll and find his groove and all that kind of stuff, though I doubt it. At the end of it, Pawlenty is just not a charismatic guy.
You might say.
And he fakes it really badly. And, as I said on Twitter last night, if you hit mute while the guy's talking, he looks like he's sort of sternly explaining to a third grader why he's going to have to be in detention for the whole week.
Yeah.
And so I think, he's ill-suited for a primary, electorate. And so is Mitt Romney. But Mitt Romney is at least battle-tested from the last primary that he's learned how to sort of dodge a lot of the pitfalls that are out there for him.
And Romney looks presidential. He's totally the guy who would play the role in the movie.
Oh yeah, no, he is the Lifetime Movie of the Week President of the United States.
Yeah. Now, do you agree with some of the, I guess, the drift of the Fox commentary that was online during the commercials, at least? I don't know if it was on TV. Was that Michelle Bachmann had made a mistake in being too harsh, in particular toward Pawlenty, and lost her kind of the presidential aura that she had apparently gained in the debate I didn't watch. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I personally, I like Michelle Bachmann. I do. I think she's a charming lady. I've met her a few times. I agree with her on a lot of stuff. but at the same time, you don't. I don't see her as a viable presidential candidate. I get a lot of grief from people on the right about it. And I think that part of the problem with her is that she knows what she knows, but she doesn't really know why she knows it. And so it gets her into these positions where you can just sort of see that she's sort of checking off boxes on what she is supposed to say. And she says it effectively and all the rest.
She does, actually.
But if you push her on it, her explanations don't always work. She has I don't want to get into a big beat up on Michelle Bachmann thing, but I personally don't think she has the discipline to make it through the primaries as a front runner. And basically what Romney has done is sort of brilliantly use Bachmann and boost Bachmann, because what he wants is for her to crush Pawlenty, which is so far succeeding, and and suck up all the oxygen, so that it boils down to a sort of Romney versus Bachmann race, and then Romney wins all the anybody but Bachmann votes. And I think that strategy was working kind of brilliantly until Rick Perry decided that, if this is the best the GOP can do, why the hell am I not getting in there? And I don't know what Rick Perry does to the Romney strategy.
Yeah. Am I right to think, on the basis of having really watched her in action for the first time last night, that Michelle Bachmann actually is possibly a little smarter than Sarah Palin?
I certainly think she's. Look, raw cognitive SAT solving, whatever power I can't speak to, because I don't think Sarah Palin's nearly as dumb as people think she is. But I think Michelle Bachmann is a lot more fluent and sophisticated on a lot of these issues. She sort of has to be, simply by virtue of the fact of her background, the fact that she is the only federal office holder in this race and has been in Congress for a long time, duking it out on these issues. I have friends who know her on a professional level, either as lobbyists or on the Hill and all that kind of stuff, and she can talk in the minutia about a lot of tax issues and that kind of thing with real sophistication. Again, that doesn't mean I think that she's ready for the presidency, but I also think that the rush to underestimate all of these people is one of the great Achilles heels of liberalism. Is that they immediately want to say that all these people are idiotic caricatures of themselves, and that's one of the reasons why George Bush won so many political battles. That's why Reagan won so many political battles. Is liberals cannot come to grips with the possibility that their political opponents had some substance to them. Doesn't mean you have to like them or have to agree with them. And I think they make the same mistake with people like Bachmann. They've made the same mistake to a certain extent with Palin, although Palin has worked harder to sort of fulfill some of the stereotypes about her.
She's good.
Yeah, she is. And it's too bad, I think. But, Bachmann, I for one would not be all jazzed and, giddy about if I were an Obama supporter, about an Obama-Bachmann debate, because Bachmann is incredibly disciplined. Yeah. And she may not be the intellectual that Barack Obama is, but she can certainly, she would certainly hold her own if she was prepped for a debate with Obama. Yeah,
I was reasonably impressed. Now, there is the issue of dress, which I only realized last night upon reflecting on it, an issue that confronts female candidates in a way that it doesn't confront male candidates. I was looking at her, and I was thinking, she's just not quite there's something visually about her that's not quite my conception of a president. And I realized it had to do with the way she had chosen to kind of dress and make herself up. And that's a question that doesn't confront men, because for men, there's just a uniform. You just put on a suit and a red tie and a lapel American flag pin, and you're ready. But I realize women have to make a statement just by virtue of showing up. And does this strike you at all that there was something? I mean, she's a little more kind of coiffed, and there's a little bit of a difference between her and Sarah Palin. Certainly a difference between her and Hillary Clinton in terms of the visual presence made, and I think that has at least something to do with the decisions that she made that evening about what to wear and stuff. Is this crazy?
I absolutely agree with you. I think it's a good point about the general principle that women really are women in politics and women in business are put in a really unfair position of having to spend a lot more time thinking about how they're going to look,
Right.
And we can get out of the sort of we can narrowly skirt the sex differences question about whether or not they like worrying about that more than men do too. But I think there's some truth to that. But it does put them at this really unfair disadvantage. It's always amazing to me when you're in the green room at one of these cable networks and the women, the women reporters spend easily 10 times as long in the makeup chair as the men do. I mean, they have to get there earlier. They spend longer. They strategize with the makeup lady about their hair. The most in-depth I get when I go into one of those makeup chairs is I tell them where my part is supposed to be, So I agree with that. I also think there's an interesting cultural difference, and I don't know how much it's attributable to the ideological stuff and how much it's attributable to other factors. But it's interesting, you're right, Hillary Clinton dressed pretty frumpy. And I think that part of that was probably she was trying to take her edges off as a radioactive political figure.
Yeah.
But part of it is also because she's kind of more frumpy. And
she is, but also kind of frumpy is more liberal. I mean, that's one thing I realized is you almost have to make an ideological statement to get dressed as a female candidate. I mean, I finally realized what it was is that you show me a woman who looks exactly like Michelle Bachmann did last night, and I would say, first of all, okay, probably a business executive, right? It's like female business executive dress.
Right.
And I would bet, if I just saw this woman, didn't know anything about her, just looked at her, I would bet you anything she's a Republican, and I think I'd be right like 8 times out of 10. These are, whereas somebody who is a little frumpier and is a little less kind of bejeweled is less likely to be a Republican, I think, in real life, and more likely to be, more likely to be a liberal. And I realized that was kind of what was going on with me. I don't
know. That's an interesting question. I mean, is that really true? Because there might be an East Coast, West. There might be a coastal versus Midwestern bias in some of that because.
Where Bachmann is the Midwestern version.
But Bachmann is. I mean, look, she's running for president. She's on national television. She's going to dress up, obviously. But that certainly doesn't that run against the sort of stereotype of Republican women being frumpy church lady, little old ladies in tennis shoes, and all of the rest?
It runs against that stereotype. But I think if you do an anthropological analysis of women who are business executives and try to figure out on the basis of dress which ones are Republicans. She was looking Republican last night. Which, hey, she was at a Republican primary. Makes sense to me. But I'm just making the point that women are forced almost to alienate some constituency just by showing up and being visible because they have a greater range of dress choices to make, and these wind up being statements. I actually think she even looks a little more the way I'm describing than Sarah Palin does in some funny way. I don't know, but
maybe. I mean, she was a tax lawyer, because it's funny, in Washington, at least in Washington, I don't think you can look at women, professional women, and make any sweeping ideological generalizations about them because there's sort of a uniform.
Right, there was a Washington suit for women.
Right,
it's like being a man in Washington.
Yeah, and so there are a lot of very successful, power-dressing liberal women lawyers and lobbyists you see, and congressional staffers and all the rest you see around Washington that you wouldn't say, oh, she looks that way, she must be a liberal or whatever. But I think you're absolutely right about the sort of whether questions of unfairness beg analysis of sort of, okay, well, what do you do to remedy the unfairness? And I'm not sure there is anything to remedy the unfairness, but there is definitely a disproportionate challenge for women when it comes to getting dressed because you're right, it is an ideological choice at some subconscious level, just skirt versus pantsuit,
So you're not buying into my idea that there be a government agency that dictates what women wear, Jonah? Am I hearing you correctly?
I was afraid that you were going to go there, but yeah, no, probably not.
Speaking of her being a tax lawyer, how did you think she handled the question by Byron York about, she had made this career decision apparently because her husband kind of said to, and she had written somewhere or said somewhere that in the Bible it says you should submit to her husband, so she did what her husband said. right?
Yeah.
Now, and then last night what she said was, well, I just meant, submit really means respect. I mean, I respect my husband, right?
I'm not sure I buy it. I mean, I think Byron, I would hate to look at Byron's email inbox these days. And I thought it was a tough question that, better get asked by Byron and answered, at this than later down the line. But my understanding is that, you can't go back and look at the original story that she tells and just replace the word respect for submit. Right?
I think I haven't even looked back at the original story, but that was what occurred to me. Is I was bothered that Byron didn't get to ask more in the way of follow-up questions, because it's just a total non sequitur. I mean, I'm sorry, but when I respect someone, that doesn't mean I slavishly follow career advice from them, even though it makes, it nauseates me, the thought of following it. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all.
I basically agree. I don't think it necessarily holds up. I think it's one of these problems that you get when you go from sort of a inner-directed discussion of faith in your life, and then you try to translate it out into a larger secular culture. Everyone can kind of get hung up on it.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, look, I don't know. I agree with you. I mean, the idea that somehow I could get my wife to become a tax lawyer because I think it's a really nifty idea and I'm her husband is very alien to me.
I'd love that if I could do that. It's a little late. But I thought it was kind of a courageous question for Byron to ask, because it was exactly the kind of question a liberal journalist would ask. But it was just a good question. It's going to be a good question. It's going to be relevant to the general election, God knows. And I thought it was a great question.
Yeah, no, look, and she can just, obviously she can answer it. I mean, I think it's a question that's easy to answer once you get your vocabulary sort of down on it.
Yeah.
And the idea that somehow husbands or spouses aren't, fair game, that ship sailed a long time ago. We talk about the relevance of spouses in politics all the time, and politicians can't, on the one hand, talk about how their family and all that kind of stuff reflects on them and reflects on their character and all the rest, and then at the same time, the second someone raises questions about their family, say, hey, that's off limits.
Mm-hmm.
If you enter it into evidence, it's in evidence.
Mm-hmm. So enter Rick Perry. Now, all I know about him is that people say he actually is the liberals' crude stereotype of what George Bush supposedly was. I mean, in other words, from a liberal's point of view, he's George Bush, but worse. So I'm kind of hoping he just turns out to be a Fred Thompson. There's all this anticipation. Oh, yeah, look at him. He's the perfect candidate, and then he will somehow fizzle. But what's your line?
I don't know. I will say that I do suffer a little bit from Texas fatigue. And I think that, I actually was out of this, giving this talk to these Texans about a week ago, some sort of high-powered Republican Texan types. And not all of them were the biggest fans of Rick Perry. Some of them were. But they all really admire both his work ethic. Apparently the guy puts in like 12-hour days. Mm-hmm. And his incredible gifts as a campaigner. He's apparently an amazing campaigner. Mm-hmm. And you don't hear, he's brilliant all the time, but you do hear he is a sort of ingenious politician. It'll be interesting to see how much his Texas stuff, which is much more pronounced than Bush's was, plays in other places. The full Texan drawl in New Hampshire will be an interesting thing to see how that goes. It'll also be interesting to see, look, compassionate conservatism, which I think Bush largely honestly believed in, was also, though, sort of a strategy to soften the edges of a Texan conservative who had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And Rick Perry is a really conservative Texan with a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but does not have the compassionate conservatism stuff. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. But look, he may be great. My basic position is right now still more the merrier. Everybody should get in. None of my ideal candidates are in the race, which is kind of annoying.
Just out of curiosity, who's your ideal candidate?
I really think it's Paul Ryan's moment. I
don't know, man. I think he handed the opposition some pretty good talking points on Medicare with that plan. But
maybe so, but I still think it's his moment. And he's the only guy, look, since a lot of Republicans are stuck having to defend that plan anyway, you might as well have the one guy who can effectively defend it.
He's the guy.
Out there speaking for the party.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't know. Look, Rick Perry's going to shake things up. It'll be interesting to see. You're right; it might be a Fred Thompson situation. Fred Thompson's best day was the day before he announced he was running.
Yeah. Well, in terms of work ethic, Rick Perry sounds like the opposite of Fred Thompson, right? I mean, Fred Thompson was said to be a lazy campaigner.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the reasons. And also, look, I mean, it's funny. You said before this thing about, he's sort of, he's worse than Bush kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is an ongoing peeve of mine. It's the way liberals always do this, is that the second any conservative is out of office, or better yet, dead, all of a sudden liberals talk about them as if they were so much more reasonable than the conservatives we have today. You guys do this with Goldwater, you do it with Reagan, you do it with William F. Buckley. They're already doing
why,
it with
John?
Bush.
You know why? Because the conservatives keep getting worse and worse.
That must be it.
They look better and better in retrospect because in relative terms they actually are. I mean, Reagan was, more conservative than Eisenhower, but looking back, well, anyway.
I think there's a lot of there's a lot of convenient nostalgia involved in all of that.
Yeah.
People always love to tell me about how Sam Tannenhouse argues that William F. Buckley, his mission was to make liberalism smarter, which would be a thunderclap revelation to Bill Buckley. There's this burning desire to read. John Dean and Hillary Clinton and James Carville, they talk about Barry Goldwater as if he was Warren Rudman or something. I mean, it's really annoying. Anyway, we can move on. We don't have to talk about. I know Republican politics is not your favorite topic. So
it's painful, but it's like many painful things in life. You have to confront it. And you're a relatively congenial person to confront it with. So we were going to talk about the economy, which was kind of touched on last night, although why is it that nothing actually said about it is sticking in my mind? Maybe that's some kind of comment on that? I don't know.
I think it's because, I think you're right, and I think part of the problem is because if you go into a long conversation knowing what the other side is going to say about a specific thing,
mm-hmm.
you don't remember them saying it too well, mm-hmm. because you already know, it's already sort of in your hard drive. And there's not a lot that these guys say about the economy that we don't know in advance of what it is, and so you just don't pay as much attention to it.
Right. And I guess they don't really disagree so much as instead just they have various skeletons in their closet. In other words, some of them have said things in the past that their opponents can dredge up and say, this sounds like Obama, but is there a whole lot of difference among them in terms of what they don't want, are they uniform? They're uniform in not wanting new revenues. I think there was actually a show of hands last night on that issue.
Yeah, I thought that was a really bad moment for the GOP.
You mean just because it was bad that they all raised their hands, or what?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Look.
Yeah, because they even said, look, if you could get a 10-to-1 ratio of spending cuts to revenue increases, and it was just a great deal, would you do it? And not a single person on that stage was willing to say, well, okay, let's face it, that would be better for the country than continuing to play around.
I thought it was a bad moment. I think part of the reason why is those show of hand questions are almost invariably dumb.
Yeah.
And at that moment, there was all this raucous craziness in the room, and Brett was trying to get to a commercial, so he threw that question out there, and I'm hoping that some of them were a little discombobulated by it. But regardless, it's dumb.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the conservative position is to have what Bill Buckley would say is there is a presumption against raising taxes. And in fact, there's a very high presumption against raising taxes, which is the correct position as far as I'm concerned. But, why you have to sort of be categorical about this in a hypothetical is sort of crazy. I would much rather somebody in there say something along the lines of, hey, look, first of all, it's a dumb hypothetical because the Democrats would never agree to any such thing. And second of all, it's not necessary to raise taxes at all. But if given that deal, of course, I would think very seriously about taking it because it would be such a good deal. And this is a problem that Republicans routinely have, is that they want to seem like they're being resolute on principle. And instead, it comes across to a lot of people as sort of unthinkingly unreasonable. And, meanwhile, liberals, who I believe are just as ideologically and dogmatically hidebound, if not more, have a much better grasp of the language of reasonableness. Everything's on the table, which was a complete lie from Barack Obama. Not everything was on the table. Obamacare.
I don't know. He put a lot on the table, but we don't have to. We don't have to get into that. I think he's. I've said this before. Never mind. My disappointment in him is something I don't need to revisit. Go ahead.
Fair enough. But my point is that you can say you're reasonable for things as a public position, while at the same time, as a matter of negotiating reality, be very hard-handed or not. And the Republicans, they just sort of think that they have to sort of check off this, this ideological statement about this kind of stuff without sort of explaining the position, and it bothers me.
No, and I mean, I of course agree, predictably, that it's kind of a stupid position, but it's amazing that it's taken hold and gained such force, and that's what. We saw that come into play in the whole debt ceiling negotiation thing, and I think it's the reason that they didn't wind up with one reason that what David Brooks deemed a no-brainer, whether you like it or not. It certainly was attractive from the point of a whole lot of moderate conservatives, and I think it's probably the reason that Standard & Poor ultimately downgraded the debt. I think it is more than any other single thing the reason that the political system now just seems like incapable of really moving forward on this thing.
Well, let me back off some of this thing. I'm absolutely in lockstep agreement with the Republican Party that we shouldn't raise taxes. I think that you could. I am very much in favor of tax reform and tax simplification, and I would personally support paying more, having a higher net tax bill if it came with real simplification. I spend a lot of time worrying about how to pay my taxes, how to arrange my taxes, and all the rest. If I could save the opportunity costs that are associated with my taxes in exchange for paying marginally more, I'd be in favor of that. But that's a prudential question. I do not think that we should be just simply raising taxes as a matter of policy right now. But my problem with the Republican answer is that they took it as a position, that it's never necessary to raise taxes. And that's just simply not true. Even wild-eyed Laffer curve supply-siders understand that there are places along the Laffer curve where it makes sense to raise taxes to maximize revenues and maximize, while allowing for growth.
But I guess what I don't understand is if there are times when it makes sense to raise taxes, why is this not a time when it would make sense to raise taxes on upper-income people? I mean, we have this huge deficit and debt that we need to do something about. I mean, I can imagine a response to this question. I'm just curious what your response is to the question of kind of, if not now, when?
Look, we have a problem. We have a spending problem.
Sure, we do, but
it's not. We are not an undertaxed country. We're an overspending country.
Well,
and you could bring back I don't really want to get into a whole Bush tax cuts kind of thing, but we could bring back all of that kind of stuff, and we would still be running wild ass deficits, right?
Well, you could say the same about spending, Jonah. I mean, you could do everything that is conceivably politically feasible on the spending side, and still have a big deficit and a huge debt. That's my point.
Your definition of what is politically feasible is probably different than mine. But at the same time, at the end of the day, the Republicans have learned some lessons from. And this is a prudential thing. This is not an ideological. Have learned some lessons about how tax cuts and trading tax cuts for spending cuts. Trading tax hikes for spending cuts actually works. And you always get the spending hikes, and you very rarely, if ever, get the spending cuts. And it seems to me that in this situation where we're spending 40 cents, we're borrowing 40 cents for every dollar that we spend, fixing the spending problem is where you should be concentrating your energies rather than funneling more revenues into a system that is doomed to failure anyway. It was Barack. Besides, remember, it's Barack Obama who kept saying you don't want to raise taxes in a recession.
That is, to me, the plausible answer, not necessarily the right answer, but the plausible answer to the question of why not do it now. I think there is a case that there's the Paul Krugman case, I guess, not that he would be against taxing the rich people, but that we need net stimulus now, and it's a
look, if you're a Keynesian, you have to be a Keynesian on both ends, right? I mean, you can't just say it's that spending is super terrific, awesome, but but tax hikes are absolutely necessary because you're just you're taking with one hand what you're giving with the other.
Well, it depends. I mean, and that leads to the question of whether for example, if you tax rich people and give the money to like unemployed and poor people. And it's revenue neutral on net. I think that is net stimulus. It doesn't increase the deficit or the debt, and on balance, it provides a stimulus because the poorer people are more likely to actually spend the money than the rich people. I think there's actual empirical evidence about this. So I don't think it's quite as...
There's also empirical evidence that if you keep giving money to unemployed people, they're more likely to stay unemployed.
That's true, but I think, we're in a time, first of all, there's various kinds of relief you can give low-income people. I'd be in favor of a tax cut for the working poor that was financed by higher taxes for the rich. But I would also say that right now, given the economy, it's not like there's all these jobs lying around and all these lazy bums lying around on a couch. I mean...
Look, as someone who thinks that basically the entire Obama presidency was destroyed by the stimulus and how he handled the stimulus, I basically agree with you. I think what we could have done... I think Newt Gingrich actually had a great idea, which was just have a absolute suspension, 1-year suspension of the payroll tax as the stimulus. It would have cost about the same. It would have been far more Keynesian in terms of its stimulus power. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't have bought off all of these bureaucrats and labor unions and Democratic constituencies, which had no stimulative effect whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And would have been the right thing to do. I mean, I agree that...
So would you favor now an ongoing cut in the payroll tax financed by slightly higher taxes on people making over, say, $500,000 a year?
I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think about it. I mean, again, it depends what mode we're in. I mean, do we need a third stimulus right now? Do we need to, and all the rest? I don't know. But I mean, I'm not ideologically locked into saying no to it. I'm not sure it's necessary. I'd have to think about it.
Okay. So
we should move on from
yeah. Well, what else are we going to talk about? I've got a list. We
got riots, right?
Riots. Yeah, the riots in England, they seem to be, depends on what happens tonight when people start doing their Friday night drinking, but they seem to be winding down. There's this interesting question of the role of technology and the role of BlackBerries. I do think of this as a subset of a larger phenomenon we've seen in, ranging from the Arab Spring to riots in China, which has a lot of spontaneous kind of mass disobedience in response to grievances against the government. And I think a whole lot of it is information technology abetted. Some of it we in America seem to like, and some of it we don't like. But I do,
But do you really? Don't you find that some of this sort of Twitter revolution stuff is wildly overblown? I mean, it's not like we haven't had riots and revolutions and mass movements before the invention of Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of stuff.
No, it's not. I would, and I wouldn't say that information changes in information technology are always going to favor or always going to decentralize power. However, I do think there are times in history when they do decentralize power, because the history of mass media, of media, is to initially be controlled by relatively powerful elites. This includes writing itself. In ancient times, it was only scribes who even knew how to write, and the upper class controlled the scribes, and they used that to control the people. Then literacy spread. That was a decentralizing effect. Another threshold was the printing press, and that's why I think it's not a coincidence that the Reformation happened in the wake of that. Without the printing press, a guy like Martin Luther King could not have gotten those essays distributed in various cities in Europe.
You mean a guy like Martin Luther?
What did I say, Martin Luther King?
Yeah.
Yeah, I take that back. Thank you. Yeah, he doesn't fit so much into my grand theory of history. I think Martin Luther King, except that actually as literacy spread among black people, that was kind of empowering. But but now I think one of the big things that's going on is video, which had been centralized. I mean, remember, the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War totally controlled what video their people saw. Totally. And video is a very powerful medium. And now you've got a situation where increasingly just about anybody can get the video they want seen if there's an audience for it. And this is subjecting all these authoritarian governments to a kind of transparency they have not known before. And video is, of course, not the only realm in which this is happening. But I do think so. What I would say is it's not just Twitter per se. It's whenever there has been a period when the control of information was relatively centralized. And then whenever technology comes along that decentralizes, and that includes, the modem, the desktop printer, the iPhone video, camcorder, and YouTube, and all kinds of things, I think these are periods of instability because you see a redistribution of power. This is my grand theory.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I'll see if I can find it for you. I remember reading either in high school or maybe college in National Review, one of those little editorial squibs in the week about how in the Soviet Union it was required to chain up the photocopy machines every night. And the point was sort of the obvious one, which is you can't be a modern, nimble society and economy when you have to padlock the Xerox machines every night.
Right.
And so I agree with you. This is one of these things that, it's one of these interesting topics, it does fit with some of your non-zero stuff and all that, there's a certain kind of cornucopian sort of love of technology that it's always on the side of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a long-term truth, but it's often very untrue for short-term periods, which can be the length of someone's relevant lifetime, And so when people say, technology always advances the cause of human freedom, well, it didn't in Nazi Germany. It didn't for tens of millions of people in Mao's China. There are.
And these were periods, by the way, in radio and television. The two most kind of viscerally powerful media were very centrally controlled.
Yeah, I just saw this thing on the news last night. Did you see this about Vladimir Putin? I mean, he's such an old school, sort of 1930s fascist, Stalinist, propaganda guy. It's so brilliant. It's his third scuba diving trip ever. He's learning how to scuba dive, and he scuba dives in 6 feet of water, and somehow he's so good at it, he miraculously discovers 2 6th century antique urns that no one had ever seen before.
Isn't that amazing?
And it leads the nightly news. I mean, he really is Superman.
That is amazing. And maybe that claim will never be debunked, even amid the Twitter revolution.
Yeah.
He does seem a little ham-handed.
All right, so here, I want to ask you a question about the riots per se. I mean, despite the sort of exciting feature that a bunch of thugs and goons can coordinate their attacks on decent people via their BlackBerry Messenger technology, why is it that, do you think, that liberals and the left seem to have so much cognitive dissonance when it comes to talking about riots.
You mean
why do they always have to end? Why do they always have to throw in the but? There's no excuse for violence, but, and then talk about social programs and all the rest.
Well, because concern for the unemployed is one of their long-standing talking points. It's part of their ideology to put more emphasis on curing. Well, actually, you would argue if I put it that way, and I certainly don't hear you argue. But I would say sympathy for the downtrodden is something that liberals cherish. Now, you may say these people aren't downtrodden. I do think a whole lot of these guys are unemployed in Europe. Not only you can come up with these anecdotes about looting being done by upper middle class guys. But I do think this is not unrelated to the economic frustration that a lot of people feel. So, I think that's the answer. I'm not personally saying, but we should condone it. I do think it's always worth, it makes sense to say, to look at why these things happen, and if one of the reasons is the economy is a mess, it's another reason to try to make the economy not a mess, because as lamentable as it may be that people riot, we know that people do riot when enough people feel that they're not getting a piece of the action. So there.
Okay. I find it sort of a terribly reductive sort of economics explains everything argument that really does not go very far with me. The claim that somehow these guys, first of all, it's a desire to translate absolutely shameful criminal behavior into a kind of political protest that I find to have no place in sort of decent discourse. And it is also an attempt to sort of rationalize government programs as the only way to keep. It's an interestingly reactionary and right-wing argument that liberals make in a certain sense, because it's basically saying, look at these lower classes. They're savages, and if we don't keep them well-fed and well taken care of with sort of a paternalist welfare state, they're going to rebel and protest.
No, I would say it's more like it's not like this class of people is for genetic or some other reason savages. It's more like saying any group of human beings subject to enough deprivation will become savages, or will act on particular occasions like savages. So
but keep on the actual. You use words like deprivation.
Well, I know they're not starving to death, but
there is no deprivation. This is all an aesthetic thing, right? This is
it's not
the
aesthetic.
idea that
Look, not having a job, Jonah, is a really psychologically painful and difficult thing. It strikes almost at the essence of what it is to be a human being, which is to be esteemed by your peers, which is to be succeeding and seen as thriving and seen as playing a significant role in the larger society. When you're unemployed, none of those things are happening to you. That's really a painful thing. It's not surprising that people do extreme things.
Yeah, look, I agree with you that unemployment is a terrible thing to undergo and all of the rest, and I think that's a perfectly fine point as far as it goes. I'm just not sure it goes nearly as far as a lot of people want to make it to. I mean, I'm reading the British press, I'm watching these clips on YouTube of British TV debates and all of the rest, and the argument is that somehow these riots were caused by cuts in social spending and the increases in tuition fees, which haven't taken effect yet, and that somehow this explains the fact that a bunch of white, black, and Asian thugs are beating up and robbing a bunch of white, black, and Asian store owners and shopkeepers and all the rest.
The fact that a policy hasn't taken effect yet doesn't mean it can't become a motivating grievance. I mean, Obamacare hadn't taken effect when people and Tea Partiers were disrupting town hall meetings and stuff because of it.
Fair enough, but at the same time, when you actually look at, when you listen to the town hall, when you listen to the Tea Party town hall protesters and all the rest, they explain their motives pretty clearly, which is they don't want to pay for all of this, they don't want to see government grow and all the rest. When you look at what the explanation of the motives are of the people who are actually kicking in store windows and setting fire to cars and beating up decent people in the streets, the motivations have none of that political sophistication whatsoever, and the liberals are essentially imposing it on there as a rationalization. The actual statements by these people are, gosh, it's a lot of fun to steal stuff. Let's have some fun with anarchy. Let's, let's have a payday. It is not a sort of sophisticated critique of the failures of neoliberal economic policies or anything of the sort.
Well, yeah,
it's a bunch of criminals.
I think it's true that your average rioter is not a well-spoken, political advocate. And look, I don't claim to have done an extensive study of these people, and I'm not even claiming, especially, that most of them have clear political grievances. I do think that mass unemployment is a recipe for bad things to happen, and I would say in totally different contexts where, for example, Saudi Arabia, where so many of the actual native Saudis don't have to work. That's a kind of a problem. I mean, people just, they need something to do in life, and it's bad when they don't have
the desire for thymos, or however it's pronounced,
thymos.
It's a real thing, and but it seems to me that in a place like Britain, where you have the government taking up more than 50% of the economy, the argument that if we could just get it to 55%, we wouldn't have these sorts of problems is sort of a non-starter with me.
Okay.
But, is there anything else you want to talk about? Because I got to get going kind of soon.
Well, we were going to, but we can put it off. We don't have to. You had this piece about media bias, but, this has been so congenial. Why turn this into a potential shouting match? I'm curious, you're not a 1 minute question would be, you're not following golf closely enough to have a view on whether we should be relishing Tiger Woods' current abject failure?
I'm not following it closely enough, other than the fact that I know that Tiger Woods is not having a good time.
Oh, but in this final major of the year, it's just his first round has been just almost unbelievably pathetic. It's a larger question about whether we should care about morality plays in real life, right? Like if someone is seen to have taken the risks he took in doing the things he did, should we hope for them to fail as a way of, do these things have traction in actually motivating people? When they see somebody fall prey to the classic, just mythic kinds of temptations and hubris, and if we think those things are indeed not good, and we'd rather people didn't fall prey to them, should we kind of actually hope for them to fail so that the message will be sent to young people that doesn't work?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's a sort of a no-brainer for a conservative, right? I mean, because first of all, if you're conservative, it's not that just you want these narratives to be confirmed, right? It's that you actually believe these narratives are confirmed because they speak to something fundamental about the nature of society, about the crooked timber of humanity, and all of the rest. And so there's a certain, from a conservative point of view, there's a certain predictive power to these insights, and that you might have predicted that Tiger Woods' life was going to unravel a bit until he got his act together at the very least, right? I mean, it's not like conservatives don't believe in redemption and and all of the rest. And so, one of my favorite lines, I use it all the time, is from Edmund Burke. He says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. We should want to see these kinds of, if they're going to happen, and the sort of the ship has sailed on Tiger Woods' privacy, right? I mean, the idea that there are, I'm not saying that we should have a reality show where we focus on every failed marriage and every blown up career due to someone's problems, but the Tiger Woods show is out there regardless, and it seems to me it'd be a strange moment to turn off the cameras at the moment where he gets his comeuppance. Yeah,
I mean, I have to admit that being a liberal who more or less agrees, at least I have that impulse. I'm skeptical of the impulse because I think it may have less noble roots than the ones you just laid out. But I basically just intellectually agree.
Well, Schadenfreude's there too. I'm not saying it's exclusive.
Well, yeah, kind of that. That's what I kind of worry about. But there are other things going on. But I just think it's really, really true that young people learn this way, and society is so full of easy rehabilitation. I mean, I think Anthony Weiner may have tested the limit. Okay, it's like Elliot Spitzer gets a talk show, right? Right. But Anthony Weiner may not. Maybe that's the limit. But by and large, rehabilitation, we should stop. I'm starting to sound like a conservative, and we don't want that to happen. But it is the case that if Tiger Woods becomes a kind of mythic failure, and really it is on that scale. If you kind of follow golf and know the story, it would be on that scale if he now fails to beat Jack Nicklaus's record for career majors. It will be a kind of exception in the modern world, I think, because it just seems almost hard to screw up so badly that you're not ultimately forgiven. And maybe the reason that this doesn't apply to Tiger Woods is because it's not a case of being forgiven. He would be forgiven if he started winning again. And what's happening is that something seems to have happened to his body and his mind, including injuries, but also, whatever.
Yeah, look, there are different layers of conservatism. I don't think you should be terrified. I think this is one of the problems that I think that intellectual partisans on both sides get into, is that they don't want to follow their conclusions if they take them into enemy territory at some point. And it is a huge disadvantage for liberalism if they're going to reject the sort of basic feedstock sort of civilization that you make terrible mistakes and there are consequences, right? I mean, that you're going to cede that territory to as a purely conservative insight is doing terrible injustice to Reinhold Niebuhr and to Isaiah Berlin and all those kinds of guys who at least understood some of the and all the neocons guys, even the ones who stayed liberal. So I think it's a good thing. I think you're right, though, sadly, that if Tiger Woods was doing great in golf, everybody would be saying, wow, what a great comeback story. This guy, was dealt some hard knocks and all of the rest, as if the relevant problem was, or the relevant issue was his golf game and not the fact that he was sort of an unmitigated pig.
I will.
So, but Michael Vick's a good case. Look, I was very hard on Michael Vick when that story broke, right? And because I'm a sort of
you're a dog lover, so I know that.
I'm a crazy dog.
Me too.
And what Vick did was terrible, and I wrote a bunch of things about it. But at the same time, look, this is a guy who did terrible things that are actually pretty common all too common in the world and even in America.
Right.
And it cost him tens of millions of dollars, and he went to jail. And so, the idea that he can't then come back to football strikes me as sort of nuts, And he's going around, he's doing penance, he's talking to groups and all of the rest. It seems to me that's the way the story should play out in a certain way, right? I mean, it's more difficult when you completely humiliate your wife and humiliate yourself with the sex scandal than it is when you do something like dogfighting. But at the same time, the principle holds is that's the arc you want to see. Is someone do something terrible. First of all, you'd rather they not do anything terrible, but if they do something terrible, that they pay a price for it, serious consequences, and then atone for it. And I think those sorts of lessons shouldn't be seen through an ideological prism. They should be seen through sort of this is what gets us through life kind of prism.
I mean, of course, there's disagreement between left and right sometimes on what constitutes a very serious crime, and is extramarital affair so serious, and so there's that issue too. Before we go, I want to, having sounded
I don't know any conservative that wanted to charge Tiger Woods with a crime.
No, I mean, crime was in a moral
an offense.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any liberals who want to say that what he did wasn't an offense to his wife and to common decency.
Right. But but there are liberals who just think sexual license in general is a less serious problem than conservatives tend to think.
Yeah, sure.
And I should, having sounded like a conservative, I should at least close with the classic liberal there, but for the grace of God line, which is that if I face the kind of temptation these guys face, I am not assuring anyone that I will not wind up like Tiger Woods. I mean, it's easy, it's easy to walk through life without, well, I won't, and never mind. But I said this about Bill Clinton. The guy's president. There's a lot of temptation out there when you're president. But at the same time, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, look, if that's reported, I'm not sure that's. I don't think that's necessarily a point that conservatives would want to cede as purely a liberal insight. I mean, it seems to me that to think about things ideologically is to say that you have certain biases and prejudices that are intellectually and rationally and morally grounded. They're not sort of glib or bigoted, but they are, these are my checklist of my priorities kind of thing. And what you don't want to do is lose the categories, right? So we can say, sure, cheating on your wife is evil or wrong or repugnant or whatever label you want to put on it, but that doesn't mean it's not a human thing to do and that humans don't get caught up by temptation.
Right.
What I reject in the liberal arguments is to say that we should get rid of the categories.
Right.
I would rather be forgiving of people who make mistakes than to say there's no such thing as mistakes.
Right. And there is this fact that for any moral system to be robust, I think it has to be the case that even people who sometimes violate rules and have violated rules, which means all of us at some level, some rule, right, have to heartily support the punishment of people who violate the rules. It's a weird thing, and it has to do with the fact that hypocrisy even possibly is an essential part of a functioning moral system, but it's all very complicated. And that's my last.
We can agree on that.
My last word on this. It's all very complicated. Well, thanks. This has been a lot of fun, Jonah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Do it again. Yeah.
All right, man.
Okay. See ya.